This is David Crosby. I'm at Wells Methodist Church in Jackson, Mississippi on Monday, the 30th of March, 2015, and I'm interviewing Jim Young, James W. Young, for the Wells Oral History Project. Jim, do I have your permission to make this recording?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Okay, I see by your bio sheet that you were born in Seattle, and you were about to tell me a story about that.
My folks met during the war. My father was in the Navy and based out of Seattle. My mother worked for a Navy supply place, and they married, and right at the end of the war I was born in Seattle. He was discharged, and as soon as I was old enough to travel, he brought us to Mississippi, where his home was.
I see. So just Seattle was just an accident of your
I was born there and lived there 6 weeks, and then moved to Mississippi, Greenwood.
I see that your mother was born in Israel. I mean, your wife was born in Israel.
My wife was born in Israel in 1948. She's
48.
as old as Israel.
As old as Israel.
And she came to the States when she was 10 years old. The family wanted to escape the constant war and alerts that were going on, so they came to the States, and she eventually made her way to Mississippi.
The 60s were a turbulent time in Israel, obviously. I guess all the times are. But, so then you grew up in Jackson?
I grew up in Greenwood. In the Delta.
And your father had left the Navy by that time?
Father had left the Navy and returned. He had been working for a bank in Greenwood, and he returned to the bank after the service. And he had a few years that he was in the Navy Reserve and got called up for Korea, but then got a final discharge during the Korean conflict, and so he was out of the military then.
And I see that you worked in Jackson as a newspaper reporter.
I worked initially. I attended the University of Memphis and interned at the Commercial Appeal, and worked in bureaus in Greenville and Batesville, covered Northwest Mississippi, and then came to Jackson in 1973 as Capital correspondent.
Did you meet Sarah then, or
not then?
Daughter? No. She was a Capital correspondent for the Clarion Ledger, and then after you, she became the same thing for Commercial Appeal. I served a faculty internship at the Commercial Appeal back in summer of, I think it must have been 95, somewhere.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It was a lot of fun. Your religious affiliation says United Methodist.
I was brought up as Presbyterian in Greenwood, and had a period of time after I reached the age of all knowledge at 19 that I rejected the church and God and everything else and anything to do with it, in part mainly because of my arrogance, but in part because of what was happening in Greenwood at the church where I grew up.
Could you describe that for us?
Well, as a child, they taught us Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world, red and yellow, black and white. They are precious in His sight. And then in 1964, I had graduated from high school and was home for the summer of '64 after my freshman year. And the Sunday school teacher for the college class, who was also the district attorney in that area, had Sunday school lessons on how the society would deal with the civil rights law that was being discussed in Washington. And the church, because it was the summer of '64, on Sunday mornings during the service, locked the doors and stationed ushers outside the doors of the church, and that really was contrary to my understanding of what a church was supposed to be. And I left. I quit going to church and pretty much became an atheist or an agnostic. And
Were there others among your friends who reacted in a similar way to the?
not many, and we didn't. Those who did, we didn't talk about it. It was not a good time to be talking about heretical views. And I was basically out of Greenwood anyway, because I was at Memphis State most of the time, and it was a different culture there.
In what way?
There were black folks at Memphis State, not many, but we went to school with black folks, and in the dorm, the people I associated with weren't burdened by the prejudices that most of us grew up with.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was just a totally different culture.
Did you study journalism at Memphis
I
State?
studied journalism and political science, and
Mm-hmm.
started off as a political science major, and then became a double major and took just about all the political science courses and journalism courses and nothing else.
When you began working as a reporter in Memphis, did that put you into contact with a lot of people different from you in background?
A few. As an intern in Memphis, I didn't. I was there part time at night, and there were old reporters around, and I dealt with them and in contact with them. And then in the summer after my junior year, I worked in the bureau in Greenville in summer of '66. And that brought me into contact with folks who were working for the Delta Democrat Times and with Hotting the Third,
Mm-hmm.
Little Hotting, and that was an exposure to a different sort of Mississippi life.
Mm-hmm. Well, 64 to 68 thereabouts was the period of the organizing for the Freedom Democratic Party in Mississippi. Do you remember
Yeah.
that era?
I remember that era in Greenville. Of course, '64 was the convention where the Freedom Democrats were seated, and the regular delegation, the Mississippi delegation, walked out, the white folks. But I was in '66 stationed in Greenville. My office was in the building around the corner from the office of Doug Wynn, who was close to Lyndon Johnson and who had stayed at the convention. He was a regular Democratic delegate,
Mm-hmm.
and he was a member of the delegation who stayed because his family was close to the Johnsons. And I remember that. I remember the walkout, and I remember the recognition of the Loyalist Democrats.
Well, it was a pretty memorable time.
Yeah.
Was there a lot of reaction to that in Greenwood?
In Greenwood, there wasn't really reaction to it because they were all gung-ho. The white folks were all gung-ho over Barry Goldwater.
Mm-hmm.
He had voted against the Civil Rights Act of '64, and that was the litmus test. And of course, then white society in Greenwood became totally dedicated to, in a positive way, to Barry Goldwater rather than in a negative way toward Democrats.
Mhm.
And that was one of the beginnings of the transition in Mississippi politics, was that election.
The beginning of a movement away from the Democratic Party
Right,
and into
right,
the
right,
Republican Party.
right. Of course, we still had Democratic delegation in Washington and Democrats at the state level, but that was the beginning.
All that political science you studied, did that carry over into your journalism? Did you cover a lot of politics?
Covered a lot of politics, especially after I graduated. In '67, the governor's race, I was working out of Batesville for the Commercial Appeal in the Northwest. We had 13 counties in Northwest Mississippi, and I covered local politics, and when state candidates came through, I'd catch them. John Bell Williams was running. Of course, William Winter was running. And I remember I also covered the re-election campaign of the local district attorney up there, a guy named Cliff Finch, who was everybody's good friend. And so I got to know Cliff on a local level before he eventually ran for governor.
With his bulldozer and his hard hat?
His bulldozer and his hard hat, and his firm handshake, and his uppers and downers. And
Yeah, I think he was governor when I arrived in Mississippi. 73.
no, Waller was governor
Oh,
in
that's right, it was
77.
Bill
Waller.
Yeah.
Waller ran in '67 for governor, and he was the district attorney who had prosecuted unsuccessfully DeLay Beckwith, who was a Greenwood boy, and unsuccessfully, and so he pretty much campaigned on that. Little remembered is the fact that DeLay ran for lieutenant governor that year, and I ran into him on the campaign trail a few times, and it was funny because I had known the family in Greenwood growing up, and since I was a local boy, he was cordial to me. But he ran a pretty racist campaign for lieutenant governor after his acquittal in the death of Medgar Evers.
But Waller was able to run in Mississippi on the basis of his having prosecuted.
Right. He ran unsuccessfully, and of course the big contest that year was between William Winter and John Bell. William had been state treasurer, and had been a progressive legislator before he was state tax collector, and then he was state treasurer. And William was a voice of moderation. John Bell was a voice of reaction and resistance, and John Bell slaughtered him in the Democratic runoff that year, and so we had 4 years of John Bell Williams, and then William ran for lieutenant governor in '71, 4 years later, and won it. And Bill Waller ran for governor and won. It was sort of a reaction, I think, to the administration of John Bell, plus the fact that by '71, black folks were registered to vote, and they had not been very significantly registered in '67. One thing growing up in Greenwood in the '50s, and then watching it in the 60s, I remember the voting rights marches. And, one of my other complaints about the Presbyterian Church there was that there was a maid at the Presbyterian Church who was pretty active in the marches to the courthouse to register to vote. And the Greenwood Commonwealth at that time was very busy publishing the names of everybody who registered to vote and attempted to register to vote. And, the maid who was active in the movement was fired by the Presbyterian Church, and she went to work in the homes for my mother and 2 or 3 other folks that were sort of clandestine, opposed to what was going on.
So your family was not particularly in sympathy with the white supremacist?
No. My father never talked about the racial things. Mother was originally from Nebraska and then Washington State, and she was very much concerned about it. They had friends who were also pretty concerned about it, about what was going on, and I remember that they circulated in a plain brown envelope a copy of a speech that James Silver had made up north someplace called Mississippi a Closed Society, and it pretty well captured what was going on in the state. But this was passed around in Greenwood as if it was some very, very dangerous material, and it was just secretly passed, and Mother read it, and some of her friends read it.
That later became the title of his book.
Right. And I think the book was based, it was just an expansion of his speech. The Klan was pretty active in Greenwood, throwing circuit in the morning. You'd go out and pick up Commercial Appeal out of your driveway, and also pick up the Klan sheet that had tirades against black folks and Catholics and Jews.
They were delivered by the same person?
No, they just delivered. They show up at night on your yard, and so they were pretty active. My earliest memories of anything civil rights, first time I ever saw a helicopter was when they had the accused killers of Emmett Till in the Greenwood jail. They were holding them in Greenwood because I don't think there was a jail in Tallahatchie County that would have tried to restrain them. So they were held in Greenwood at this jail at the courthouse, and they had National Guard troops all around the courthouse to make sure that their friends didn't come to bust them out of jail, and had a helicopter that went around town. It was my first view of a whirlybird in 56, 57.
Yeah, it's very early.
Yeah.
That sound still that a copter makes reminds me of the Francis Ford Coppola movie about Vietnam. The playing of the Ride of the Valkyries.
Yeah, the Wagner.
Yeah. When did you begin to rethink your wisdom of rejecting the church? And
in '78, I was engaged to a young lady who had been coming to Wells and was telling me what a neat church it was, and because I was engaged to her, I humored her, especially after she said that you could wear blue jeans, and I came with her in November of '78, mainly to test the blue jean claim, and we sat up in the balcony in a far corner, hidden of the balcony, and so nobody would see me, and I wouldn't be hassled. And
Hassled, like being pressed to join the church, or
pressed, welcomed,
or being
just known,
no,
seen. And I guess the first time I came here, it stirred something in me. There was something about the room and the spirit, and I've come to view that as the spirit was definitely in this place.
Was
and
it in the preaching, or
it was in the
congregation?
it was in the preaching. It was in the congregation. It was just in the room. I mean, I walked in and felt something, and felt strangely moved. Or, Wesley talks about being his heart strangely warmed. Well, it didn't happen all at once, but gradually that's what happened to me. I became more and more attracted to this place and to the people.
So you were in your early 30s then? Is that-
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was
And were you working
30,
at the...
33, and it's still commercial appeal.
Mhm.
Came in '78, and we came on an irregular basis when Channel 17 didn't have a good movie on Academy Award Theater. Sunday morning we'd come, and it got to be where God was speaking through this church and this congregation and that preacher, and it became more and more important, and priorities changed.
Do you think it was closely related to the social justice aspects of the church, or just more overall religious conversion?
It was at first it was the social. There was a handful of black folks here, and that was something totally different for church than I had experienced. And there were other folks. There were gay folks, and gay folks in '78, '79, and '80. That was still not really socially acceptable, but all sorts of people, and the sign out front said "Everyone welcome," and it was a place where that statement was true. The church lived up to that billing, "Everyone welcome," and that attracted me. And then the funniest thing was one Sunday morning I was sitting up in the balcony, and the choir came out and did an a cappella version of "Jesus Loves Me," and it was a spiritual experience. And then attendance became a spiritual thing, really and truly. So first it was the social awareness and the social acceptance, and then that's the way God works on some people, is you get them here and then you hook them.
Well, from hiding in the back corner of the balcony to being openly associated with the church, how long a process was that?
See, November of '78 was my first time here, and I joined the church in May or June of May of '82. So it was a 3.5 year process, and joined the church, and then a few months later joined the choir, and that put me in a visible place.
Yeah.
So.
What about other church activities, such as committees, boards, whatever, or social outreach of any kind? What did you become involved in?
Yeah, I became involved in that. This church has a policy of broad representation on the church council and the church board. And the following year, after I joined the church in '83, I was on the board and the council. And in the fall of '84, while I was in the process of getting a divorce from the lady who had brought me here, I was chairman of the council, became co-chair of the Council on Ministries. So I was pretty involved in that. And because I had a divorce, I didn't have home life anymore. I became involved in activities. I was attending Sunday school, had been attending Sunday school since '82, but there was a pretty active singles group, Keith's class, Sunday school class, and I was not in it. But this active singles group, and because I was co-chair of the council, I saw some of their activities, and I was involved in some of their stuff. We had a guy who was just all over the place involved in athletics, in the volleyball team and the softball team, and with the singles group. And they were deeply involved with the Methodist Children's Home. Children, they would take them out for weekend excursions. And they were also involved with the nursing home, community nursing home, down there near Battlefield Park. And Kim Ingram was a guy who was just out of prison, and he was a kid that was all over the place, involved in things, and he died just totally unexpectedly, and eventually the coroner said they could find no cause of death. He just died, and it was a big shock. A friend of his asked me to pick up somebody at the nursing home to go to the funeral home visitation, and I went and picked up a guy that was in a wheelchair, a little old guy named Johnny Blackley, who had sold newspapers on the corner outside the Mayflower, sold the Daily News there on the corner. Anyway, so I picked up Johnny and took him to the funeral home, and as we're going, he said, "I don't have a friend now. Who's going to take me?" And grab. And so I became a chauffeur for Johnny and church events and things, and got involved through Johnny with what the singles group was doing at the nursing home, going every Monday night and playing dominoes with some of the folks at community nursing home who were fascinating characters.
So it was a ministry of socialization, if you will?
Ministry of socialization, and bring them to church. Johnny came to church every Sunday and every church function, just about. And some of them did that, but some of them were just mainly interested in playing dominoes, and they ministered to us more than I think we ministered to them. But it was a period of time when very rich involvement in our WELS activity that changed my life. Really changed my priorities. And
I have a couple of clarification questions, I guess.
Yeah.
Where I grew up, the word Sunday school always meant little kids going to Sunday school. It was a children's thing.
Mm-hmm.
But as I talk to people at Wells, they talk about Sunday school as an adult activity, and it kind of confused me.
When I was first coming and sitting in the balcony, my wife had a son by a previous marriage, and he was 4 when we married, so he was about 5 or 6 as I was starting to get more personally involved and concerned with the church. And a lady came up to me one Sunday in the balcony, and we were not going to Sunday school at that time, and she said, "We can have somebody pick Eric up at your house and bring him to Sunday school if you want." And well, no, you don't need to send somebody to pick him up. We'll bring him. And I started coming to an adult Sunday school class discussion group while Eric went to little kids, so it was a little child leading me to Sunday school.
I see.
And it was very much there were 3 adult classes. There was Keith's class, which predominantly single and single again people, and then there was Betty Quinn's lecture class, and then there was a class that met in this room at that time, young adults discussion class, and a lot of people from Millsaps who had graduated from Millsaps and had started coming here during that time in their lives they had stayed, and they were working in Jackson and living, and so they had a discussion class that met, and that was very helpful in my development.
Yes.
And,
My other clarification question has to do with the, I think you called it the Council of Ministries or the Ministry Council.
mhm.
What was the rationale for that? I mean, what was the purpose of that group? What did they do?
That group, as Keith explains it, the Council on Ministries acts as the elders of the church, and by the name Council on Ministries, it oversaw, or supposedly oversees the ministries of the church, and proposes new ministries and puts proposals into action. The administrative board dealt with the business end of the church, the finances and the building and grounds.
Mm-hmm.
But the council was pretty much a place where anybody could say anything, propose any kind of new undertaking or improvement in any of the ongoing ministries of the church.
Mm-hmm.
It
Was there a formalization of the ministries in the sense of, ministry 1, ministry 2, ministry 3?
No. One of the attractive things about Wells is that there hasn't been a formalization of much of anything. Of course, sometimes that leads to inefficiencies, and it leads people to pull their hair out and people to storm off and say nothing can ever get done. But that's part of Keith's leadership design, is to let anybody say anything and hash things out, and then
Mm-hmm.
move forward when there's almost unanimity on a direction.
Is liturgy a word that's commonly used here?
It's become more common in the last few years. It was not, and again, for me, that was one of the appealing things, was that this was not a liturgical church. the most liturgy we had was at the opening of the service, when the lay minister would ask the congregation to share the opening sentences, and so there would be an opening sentence and a response, and then a prayer that was shared, and that was in the old days pretty much all the liturgy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, yesterday they've instituted now every fifth Sunday, every month with the fifth Sunday is a Sunday for a formal liturgical service, and I was greeted this morning when I came in with, well, how did your boycott go? Because I didn't. I don't buy into liturgy and ritual.
Well, what was the rest of the service like then? After you said the exercises, what did the community at the beginning of church?
Oh, at the beginning of church. Well, the church service has always opened with a lay minister, a lay person, welcoming, and sometimes using it as using the pulpit as a pulpit.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes to everybody's chagrin, and sometimes everybody's spiritual enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
And then after the opening, after the greeting, there's a call to worship, and then there's this opening sentence ritual that's very brief, and that was the liturgy. And then there's a period of free worship. So there is a form to it, but it's not a.
What do you mean by free worship?
Free worship is a time during the service when the pastor of the day just either leads singing or spontaneous singing or something like that. We'll take requests or we'll just do something a little different. And it's a loose, very loose time in the service.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the structure goes with a hymn, and then scripture reading, and then a responsive reading, and then announcements, life of the church they call it, and then the offering, and then the sermon, and then final hymn and benediction. There's no official invitation at the close of the service. There's a hymn of invitation, and it's generally understood that anybody who'd like to join the church or have a special prayer is welcome to come down during that hymn and take care of business.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no aggressive recruitment of members. There's no formal pledge drive for money. Those are things that are appealing to me about this church.
Yeah. Is there a Eucharist service every week? Or?
Every Sunday at the 8:30 service, and the 8:30 service came along in about 91 or 2, somewhere in there. They started the 8:30 service. Initially, it was an effort in response to a request from a Baptist person who wanted to have a union church, and so they said the 8:30 service could be this time for the union church, Baptist and Methodist, non-denominational. Anyway, that service grew into something else, and they added a formal Eucharist service at the end of the 8:30 service. Communion is offered in the alcove at the back of the sanctuary after the 11 o'clock service. And then on Sunday night, the service which has changed some considerably. The Sunday night service is communion. So communion's offered every Sunday, informally at the 11 o'clock service, after the 11 o'clock service, and as a part of the 8:30 service.
I see. Is the development of these things, is that the kind of issue that would come before the Council of Ministries, or are they much more concerned with the external relations of
It's never really come before the council. In fact, I don't know. Well, the 8:30 service was inaugurated officially by the council, although it was going to happen anyway. And the council, there's less action than there is just talking things out and getting a general agreement that we're going to do, and so actual official votes of the council are not as common as just airing things out.
no motions and calling a question?
There may be a motion and nobody votes no. It's very, very seldom does anybody vote no or want to vote recorded.
The influence of Keith Tunkel is a subject of some interest to a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
I just wondered how important you feel he has been to that spirit of Wells Church that you respond to, say.
Totally. Because he set the tone, and when I first started coming, there were no associates, and the church employed Keith. They employed a secretary. They gave a minuscule stipend to a part-time choir director, and they paid nursery workers and a janitor, and that was about it. So Keith was the driving force. It was his preaching and his outreach through his radio show and then his column in the Reporter that attracted people, drew people. That's what brought the Millsap students to this church in the early 70s, and that's what attracted the Mennonites who came, who were already in the neighborhood. And so Keith's personality and his style of pastoring very much built this church into what it is. It was, as I understand it, pretty much a traditional United Methodist church, brother so-and-so and brother so-and-so, and were preachers, and preachers got moved every 5 or 6 years. And then when Keith came here in '69, he stayed. And he stayed. And of course, he jokes that one of the bishops says, "Well, Keith, we left you here because we don't know what to do with you."
Sometimes that's a good thing.
and that's a good thing. And so the climate of acceptance and all, Keith attracted the people who made it alert, active, and alive, as one of the signs said at one time. Everyone welcome, loving, caring, and sharing, and all of those things are true about the people here. It's a strange mix of people, because we have arch conservatives and we've got me. Um, uh, so we've got a broad range of political and religious views. We have people who absolutely love the ritual and all. We have people who we've lost some people in the last few years because of our acceptance of gay folks. But we've also kept some people who are very conservative about the gay community.
It seems like a growing social phenomenon, the acceptance of gays in American society. To me, one of the most strikingly swift changes of public opinion.
The Presbyterian Church in the United States voted, one of the Presbyterian churches, I'm sure it's not the one that the Greenwood Church I grew up in is a part of, but Presbyterian Church has recognized gay marriage. There's still strong opposition within the denomination among the people who go to conferences and set UMC policy that's against it, but it's becoming more accepted, and it's the civil rights issue of our day, I guess, of this day.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think at any time that I've been at Wells I've seen any problem with black folks, white folks and black folks getting along together, which, as I say, is a far cry from what I grew up with. And one of the phenomena that we have here is biracial couples who didn't feel welcome, particularly in a black church or some white churches, for different reasons. And they come here and there's full acceptance and love. That's a big part. And again, that goes back to a lot of what Keith's leadership
Mm-hmm.
and Keith's direction. And despite the way this neighborhood has been at times, and it's not as rough a neighborhood as it used to be for a period of time. People still drive in from the suburbs to come to this church
Mm-hmm.
and be a part of the ministry here. It's funny to see very conservative people who live in Castle Woods, way out Brandon, white neighborhood, drive in to work at the food pantry and be here and befriend
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the people who come here on Tuesday morning for food.
Tell me a little more about that. Have you been involved in the food pantry?
Yeah, I was involved. I left the newspaper at the start of '89 because my priorities had changed, and because they were going to move me to Memphis, and I didn't want to go. I had too much going on here, and so something we had talked about was a group home for the elderly, and I worked to set that up right after I left the paper.
Tell me that year again.
That was at the start of '89.
Okay.
We were able to lease the Methodist Children's Home farm out off of Northside Drive on Methodist Farm Road, and leased the old farmhouse that they had out there. It had been a home for teenage boys, and we worked on renovating it, and then tried to set it up as an activity center and group home for the elderly. And it took 3 years to really get going as a group home, and ended up filling the place up with elderly folks. And I turned that over to somebody else after 5 years, and it lasted another 10, 11 years after that, until all the old folks that were there died off, and so the demand for it ceased.
Mm-hmm.
We had wanted a place for people short of nursing home or care home, a place where they could be a group and be a family, and it worked for a while. It worked while it was needed, but and then in '96 I became pastoral assistant, or church secretary really, and was involved with what we did with food giveaway at that time, which was basically people would bring canned goods, and we'd pass it out as people came to the door. And over the years it gradually evolved into an organized Tuesday morning ministry, and I bought food for it with church money. I did the shopping for it for several years while it was still going, and so I was involved mainly in supplying the food, seeing some of the folks. But,
Well, could you give me a kind of overview about how the food pantry operated?
it as I say, it was disorganized, and it was somebody'd come to the back door and ask for food, and we'd put together what we could, and then it became a bit more structured. I think when Todd Watson became associate pastor here and could spend some time organizing it, and then we began to give out food. People would come on Tuesdays, and we had a set time for giving out food, and the word would spread through the community, and people would come on Tuesday mornings, line up, and that's when volunteers would come in early and fill the bags up, and then we were able to give out food, organized food. We had a nurse who wanted to start a parish nursing program, and she started doing blood pressure screenings on Tuesday mornings during the food pantry time, and the food pantry clients themselves asked for a devotional, and so things just grew naturally as they needed. We had gleaners who would bring in truckloads of sweet potatoes or watermelons or corn, whatever they could get from farmers, and somebody brought in bread from the bread store, and things just sort of grew, and it became an organized operation.
So is it a social situation as well? I mean,
It's a social, and because they've insisted on a devotional, it's a spiritual thing too, and many of them call this their church. Some come to church, attend church here, and some attend church on Tuesday morning. But Keith does a little bit of a devotion, and they sing, and they take some leadership in that.
Do they share food together, or is it more pick up a package?
It's more pick up a package, and go get their blood pressure screening. If they need help with prescriptions, we've got a doctor who volunteers, doesn't go to this church, but volunteers and picks up meds that are not expensive, and brings prescriptions back the following day. And they are very social while they're here, and it's a good mix of people, and church folks are out there with them talking and just listening to what the troubles are. Out of that grew the ministry of taking people to get photo IDs, because so many of them didn't, and especially people just released from prison. The state of Mississippi doesn't provide a prison releasee, a parolee with an ID, but tells them to go get a job. And you can't get a job without an ID. You can't get an ID without a birth certificate. And these people don't know how to do any of that. So folks will help them get a birth certificate and then take them down to get a photo ID and help them out.
So there becomes then a kind of outreach to people coming out of prison.
Yeah.
Is there an outreach to people in prison as well?
There has been over the years, and this was something the council approved. We've participated with Prison Fellowship when it was very active in Mississippi and organized, and we sponsored work projects, and we'd have inmates come for 2 weeks at a time for a Prison Fellowship work project. And in fact, I met a guy in prison, from prison that way, and he stayed in my home, and he eventually participated in my wedding, read scripture in my wedding, and then it was sort of a conflict of interest as a reporter, but I wrote a couple of letters when he was up for parole, and he was able to get out of prison, and now he's a United Methodist minister, and I think he works at Galloway and then has a couple of churches of his own. But he was part of that. For 4 years, we had a ministry at the Restitution Center down on Gallatin Street.
I'm not familiar with that.
It was a state Department of Corrections, Hinds County Restitution Center, and inmates who were nonviolent offenders could be housed there, and they would work at a free world job during the day and report back custody, and part of their earnings would go to pay restitution to victims of their crimes. But we provided a Sunday school service, a Sunday service down at the Restitution Center for about 4 years, and in conjunction with a prison ministry that was outside the church. And then that sort of, I don't know what happened with it, but it faded, and we got involved when they opened the state veterans home at Mississippi State Veterans Nursing Home out here off of South Drive. We did the Sunday service there for until about from 89 to 2012 12, 14, somewhere in there. So,
How do you count for things like that ending?
As the veterans home thing ended, I did it for 15, 16 years and began to get burned out and needed to turn it over to somebody else because I was also pastoral assistant here, and so I turned it over to a couple who took it on and did a much better job and organized it and had music and a bulletin, and they did it for a few years, and then when they left the church over the gay issue, it sort of died. Nobody picked it up, and so I don't know what the veterans home is doing now for devotional.
So some of these ministries are dependent on having staff too,
having
who are
people
committed enough to continue.
people who are doing it, and constituents are having clients. The community nursing home ministry that was so active and vital during the mid to late 80s, early 90s. After all those folks died off, all the nursing home participants died off, then it just sort of went away. The people who were involved in that from the church who were involved in that moved on to other interests or themselves moved away, and so things have a life. There's a time for everything and a season, and when it goes, it goes.
You mentioned the people who come from suburban areas into the city to come to Wells Church. Then there's the neighborhood folks too, and I wonder what your sense of the dynamic between those two groups is.
It's acceptance. At one time, and I don't know, this may have been a Keith Tonkel exaggeration, but at one time, Keith was saying that we had more neighborhood people attending Wells than attended the two black churches that are in the neighborhood. And I think that may be true. The neighborhood folks are accepted. Over the years, we've had some characters. Again, everyone's welcome, and in the 80s, we had a guy that would come in and prophesy, and he was a big, rough-looking, disheveled character who would come in, and he would come in during the service and turn right, walk down the aisle close by the windows, and come down front and prophesy, and Keith would gently ask him to friend, wait, if you will, and let me preach, and Ivory Lee was his name, and he would go out, and he would show up during the week, and I think one time he brought a 6-pack for the secretary, Miss Lou, who was a charter member of the church. He brought her a 6-pack, and he built out of gratitude for being accepted around here, built a little brick flower bed border flower bed for a building we had out back, and we ended up doing a memorial service for him, and I think there were more church people than family
Mm-hmm.
for him when he died.
Well, on places like the Council of Ministries, or is there a mix of local people and people who are commuters?
There are not very many neighborhood folks. From time to time, we've had neighborhood folks, but not actively involved. They don't get that deeply involved. It would come on Wednesday nights for fellowship supper. A lot of time every month, we'd have them, especially young folks, and we had at various times we've had a pretty strong neighborhood presence in the youth group, and they'd go on trips with regular church folks to Lake Junaluska and retreats to Wesley Pines and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that the neighborhood children were involved. We've had neighborhood children, especially because of our association with Galloway School, who would be involved in church activities, not so much in the council,
Mm-hmm.
at the council level, but participating.
What kind of involvement do you have with Galloway School?
It's right.
Tutoring and that
Pardon. Well, there's book buddies
Mm-hmm.
people who go over and read once a week with an individual child. We used to do quarterly award assemblies, and students who had shown great improvement and students who had high academic achievement would be given a chance to pick out a prize, and they'd have sort of an academic pep rally type of thing for the children. We used to, when they had their field day every year, used to cook for them hot dogs and hamburgers, and then every year we still have Galloway Awards Night. It's a big fellowship supper, and the children who are the highest academic achievers in each classroom and those who are the most improved in each classroom are invited to bring their families, and we have a big covered dish supper downstairs, and then the awards show up here, and the church is usually filled for that, for Galloway night. And we were giving savings bonds to the children, and then had to stop that because the feds went to electronic savings bonds. You can't give them a piece of paper anymore. It's all electronic, and a lot of our kids didn't have computers and aren't going to be doing much with an electronic savings bond. So now we give them a Walmart card, and which is probably appreciated more than a $25 savings bond.
I know I'm taking a lot of your time, Jim, but what about Wells Fest? That's probably the thing most Jacksonians know best about Wells Church.
Okay.
Have you been involved with it?
Oh yeah, I was on the original committee, and in 83, I think it was, Keith married Malcolm White, conducted the wedding for Malcolm and Vivian, and here at Wells. And as the story goes, Malcolm wanted to give Keith an honorarium, and he doesn't accept honorariums for weddings and funerals. So he came up with the idea of getting some musicians to come and play, and we were undergoing a building renovation program at the time. And he said, well, I'll help the building fund, and we'll have a festival. And people from each of the adult Sunday school classes were asked to be a part of the steering committee for that. So several of us were there to organize this thing. The first one was at Millsaps, on the campus at Millsaps, in an area that's now developed into tennis courts and ball fields. That was in '84. Was the first Wells Fest, and it just we felt at the time that we couldn't be asking the community to just give us money for our building, so we split the first year's proceeds. I think it was like $1,200. We put $600 in the building fund and set $600 to a missionary we supported in Africa. And after that, all the proceeds, the net proceeds, would go to a different charity, a different service activity in the Jackson area. And it's something that kept on and grew and grew and grew, and
still growing. Right?
Still growing, and like I say, about $1,200 is what we raised the first year, and the last couple of years is between $50,000 and $65,000 that we turn over to the recipient. It's gotten organized and structured as it grew, and I guess that's a good thing, because it's a big undertaking.
Sounds like it, yeah.
We've been blessed that a lot of musicians in this community have been involved with Wells at different times and in different ways. But it's a church for a lot of musicians. And after Malcolm developed other interests, Raphael Sims became involved with recruiting the musicians, and so all these local bands donate their time and talent. Don't charge us anything. I think one time we imported, because somebody was wanting to pay his fee, imported Sam the Sham from Memphis to come down and perform. But that was the only, as far as I know, the only paid musician we've ever had.
So that's basically a fundraiser for other charities.
It's a fundraiser. It started out, and still is. We wanted a music festival that was alcohol and drug free. There's a big recovery community at Wells, again because of the acceptance, and there's an active recovery Sunday school group that meets. And there has been since 83, 84. But we wanted it to be alcohol and drug free, and we wanted something for all the family. And activities grew as we sought to meet the demand. And so now it's a big family event, and it is alcohol and drug free. One of the early Wells Fest, I guess '85, when we moved, we moved to Riverside Park because Millsaps was getting ready to develop their northwest corner. We moved to Riverside Park, and Wells Fest coincided with one of the prison fellowship work projects that we had going on, and the convicts became our security force at Wellsfest, enforcing the no alcohol. And when people, Wellsfest was still very new, and the concept of a music festival where you couldn't drink was not well accepted. The convicts were pretty tough on people that brought beer in, make them pour it out and dispose of their cans and things. Yeah, I don't know. That's yeah. Wellsfest is, and it has drawn a lot of people to this church. We've had folks that would come the day after Wellsfest for the first time. They'd come to Wells, and they'd stick around for a few years and be involved.
Well, I've just about run out of questions, but I found it's always good to ask people if, what's the question that I should have asked that I haven't?
Let me throw in a blurb about a couple of folks that I've known along the way over the years here. One of them is a neighborhood lady. She lived on a most inappropriately named street, Prosperity Street. She lived at the end of Prosperity Street over here, a few blocks away, and her name was Gertie Lee Williams. And I'm not quite sure how she got to Wells, but Miss Gertie was here in 83, 84, and we all called her Miss Gertie, and so she would respond with a courtesy title. She and I became pretty close, and I would pick her up every Sunday evening for night church here. She would drive over for 11 o'clock service, and Miss Gertie, and she'd call me Mr. Jim, and we just got involved in a thing where I'd call her every night at 10 o'clock, and we'd talk a little while and have a prayer together. Good night, Miss Gertie. Good night, Mr. Jim. But Gertie was a mainstay on the third pew center section for many years, and then she eventually spent some time at Wells House, and then had to go into a nursing home after that. But Gertie Williams was a big part of this church, and a much beloved black member of the church. Another person of great interest, and I don't know how she got here, was named Maggie J. Bass. And Maggie was a widow, and she had lost a son, and she took chaplain training in Memphis. She out of here. She came here and then went for chaplain training and came back, and I think she worked for a while with Stupot at Sims' house and ran it for a while. But Maggie was a regular member of the church and somebody very close to many of us. In fact, the little old ladies at that time had a circle, and they would United Methodist Women, and it was the only official United Methodist activity at the church. Our men's group has never been associated with the denominational men's organization, but Maggie was a part a circle that included Miss Lou, who was the secretary and a charter member of the church, and 3 or 4 other blue-haired ladies from the Old South, but she was totally accepted as a dear friend and as a leader, of studies in the UMW circle. And here was Miss Lou was originally from Leake County, Carthage, or out from Carthage, and as Old South as you could get. But she accepted Maggie as a friend and dear person, and that was the spirit of this church, was acceptance of people. And Gertie and Maggie were 2 very special pieces of the puzzle here.
You seem to have a particular interest in and maybe affection for older people. Do you know where that came from?
That came from the nursing home and the Dominoes. I ended up writing a novel that put agents and book editors to sleep, and I got plenty of rejection letters, but it was based on characters in a domino tournament, nursing home domino tournament, and a lot of the characters came out of people I met. There was Johnny Blackley, I've mentioned, and his sister Eva Cole. Both of them sold newspapers on the street. She was outside the Edwards house, which used to be the King Edward. That's what they called it in the early 60s, before it was shuttered for 15, 20 years, 30 years. But Johnny and Eva, there was a lady who, I don't know what she had done before she got to the nursing home, but she was on dialysis, and 3 times a week she'd get on the J-Tran with her wheelchair and go to dialysis 3 times a week. The nursing home didn't provide transportation, and there was an old service station guy that became a mentor to some of our folks who were in the recovery program. There was a one-legged man who had lost his leg to a train, and through him we met a guy who had both legs amputated because he had been he'd passed out behind one of those dives down there on Gallatin Street on a frigid night. He froze his legs. So met beautiful characters who had nothing and loved life and instilled that love in everybody they met. So yeah, very special place in my heart for the elderly, and that's still true.
Well, maybe we can get along.
Yeah. And one thing that we haven't talked about much, and you'll, I don't know how it'll fit in, but is the recovery thing. Okay, yeah. Because that has been a very big part of this church, has been its acceptance of people in recovery, in and out of recovery. And the James Club is an active ministry now. On Sunday mornings, the James Club is a class and they do a 12-step approach to the Bible, or they relate the Bible in the 12-step program that people are in. And the building also serves as a meeting place for a very large AA group twice a week, and a fairly large NA group 3 times a week. So that building is used quite a bit.
That's not the church building itself.
Not the church building, but it was the annex behind the church, and they've been meeting there for years and years, and it's a very good fit, and it's a big part of the church.
And is it connected to? I've never been involved with AA in any way, so I don't know much about it at all. But is it operated by members of the church or with members of the church? Or
It's hosted.
Yeah.
But and of course, each group has its own structure and its own operating. We provide the space. A big part of the ministry of the James Club, the Sunday school group, is distribution of life recovery Bibles. It's a special study Bible that again relates the 12 steps to biblical principles, and that's passed out free to anybody who comes. And some of the recovery centers here will bring their clients in on Sunday morning to the James Club meetings, and they send out quite a few to people in prison. Again, recovery Bibles. Yeah, so that's a big part too.
Great. Well, Jim, I'd like to thank you for agreeing to share this fund of knowledge with us, and I'm sure that the people who are more closely involved with the planning of this oral history are be also very grateful to be able to listen to what you've had to say.
Okay. I don't know how that fits in with the project, but anyway, that's what I know.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Thank you.